This session is described as self-reflection, and we're going to be talking about my greatest strengths and weaknesses. Now, the my in this is quite literal. I'm going to describe a way of deconstructing my own strengths and weaknesses so that hopefully it will give you some idea of some tools you can use to better analyze what you're good at and maybe what you're less good at. The reason that I think this session needs to be fairly necessarily personal is because it's quite difficult and even potentially dangerous for someone to say, this is how to identify what you're good at and here's how to identify what you're maybe less good at, because that could just be wrong. It could be a case of over-generalizing from a single data point, for a single datum, I should say, and that could be inaccurate and therefore potentially dangerous and inappropriate. Now, there are nonetheless, I think, two methods that, speaking generally, are powerful and useful if you want to assess what you're good at. Okay, so these two methods are deconstruction and CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy, and they're actually very closely connected. Deconstruction is a methodology most often associated with critical theorists of French philosophy and literature, people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. They developed these ideas of deconstructing language to try and peel the layers back from what words are supposed to mean to find out what they really do mean. So by this, we are going to assess what it even means for something to be a strength, what it even means for something to be a weakness. These words in and of themselves are slippery concepts, and they need to be better interrogated if we're going to understand how to assess our own strengths and weaknesses. And this therefore connects with a psychoanalytic therapy called cognitive behavior therapy, which is commonly used as a therapy for mental health purposes, because that encourages patients to consider their cognition, how their brain operates according to certain structures and paradigms, and how they can alter that cognition in order to affect their behavior. Okay, so someone might have a mindset which is affecting the way they think and therefore affecting their behavior, and that is all feeding back into a sense of depression or anxiety or various other things. So deconstruction as a literary methodology and CBT as a psychoanalytic methodology can help us really get to grips with what it means to have a strength and what it means to have a weakness. And I've got two fundamental arguments that I intend to make in the next sort of 40 minutes or so. The first of which is that weakness is inevitable and therefore morally neutral. Okay, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail in a second. And the second argument is that most of our perception of strength and weakness is merely that. It's perception, and therefore shot through with a dangerous mixture of delusion, subjectivity, and the imprint of other people. It is, in short, rarely objective. We rarely have an accurate sense of our strengths and weaknesses relative to other people. And what we think we know about ourselves, we often do not. Okay? So I'm going to deal with those two arguments in turn. So first of all, the weakness is inevitable. And that just stands to reason. It's something that if you think about it for a millisecond, you'll realize is patently obvious. And yet we are often surrounded by narratives that any degree of weakness is a problem. And that in itself is dangerous. It is impossible to imagine someone who is perfect at everything. And therefore, not being perfect at everything is entirely inevitable and not worthy of any degree of moral sanction. It's a completely non-ethical consideration. If we think of meta-ethics, which is the study of where ethics comes from, and ethics being the study of what's good and bad, meta-ethicists would clearly say that given that weakness is inevitable, then suggesting that weakness equals bad is just stupid. It doesn't make a shred of sense. And yet we're perpetually surrounded by this narrative that actually we should dampen down our weaknesses, we should subvert them, we should hide them, we should pretend they don't exist. And you see this, for example, all the time in films, where you get this sort of superhero character who's completely infallible. Not only are they able to perform various tasks that would be seemingly impossible, but they also have the command of the English language. They can quip better than anyone else. They can dance better than anyone else. In the case of James Bond, they are somehow miraculously capable of gambling against the odds at all gambling tables. I mean, it's just absurd. Now, we all know it's absurd, but at the same time, it does tend to feed into this ongoing, and I would argue, fairly toxic narrative that weakness is something that ought to be suppressed, hidden, and ignored. But given that weakness is inevitable, that doesn't make any sense to me. I think we should be more upfront about our weaknesses and just accept that they are going to exist. And let me give you some examples. I've had the privilege of working at Oxford University, so I've been working for over a decade with students who are incredibly intelligent. But it would be an absolute bonkers lie to say that they don't have weaknesses, despite their specific capabilities. Famously, it's often said that Oxford students are book smart, but not particularly street smart. And that's the case for many Oxford students, not all by any stretch, but quite a lot. Another famous generalization is that Oxford students lack a bit of common sense, that they're maybe good at solving intellectual puzzles, but they're not necessarily very good at more day-to-day tasks. I've got a prime example of this when I found a young man trying to heat up soup that he'd bought from a supermarket in his kitchen kettle because he thought that would be quicker. I mean, it was quicker. It was also very quick at setting off all of the fire alarms. And it was clearly a bad solution to the problem that he had of how to heat up his soup. Now, this is a guy who's now doing he's doing a postdoc at UCL, having done multiple PhDs. He's a genius, but he doesn't know where you should appropriately heat up your soup. And that's okay. And we don't, we maybe sort of joke about it, but it's not in the sense of pointing out that he has a flaw that he ought to be critically ashamed of. So that's my first point, is that weakness is inevitable, and therefore it's completely morally neutral. There's very little point in trying to make a sense of weakness equals bad and strength equals good. Okay, so that would be my first argument. And these are just arguments. You can, of course, think differently, and we'll get onto that a bit later. My second thesis, my second argument, is that most of what we think we know about strengths and weaknesses is merely a function of perception rather than reality. And that's because it's very difficult to come up with clear-sighted empirical measurements of relative strengths and weaknesses. And so we tend to be guided by mythology almost, this sort of build-up, accretion of various different narratives that people start to say about us. Oh, you're not very good at that. Oh, you're not very good at the other. Oh, you're very good at this. Even when it comes to strengths, there's a big dollop of potential delusion going on in what we think we're good at. For example, I think I can dance at wedding discos. I can't. There's documentary evidence to suggest that I can't, when people have had the temerity to film me looking like, an octopus that is out of water. So there is no question I can't dance at wedding discos, but somehow in the heady mix of that particular moment, I'm deluded enough to think that I can dance. And that's a sort of a localized example of the problem of understanding our own strengths in any sort of meaningful way, and also understanding our own weaknesses. And let me give you some empirical examples of some of this. So if we go to here, so this is how height is measured in the US. So these are what are called normal distribution curves, sometimes called bell-shaped curves. And so the red describes the heights for women in America and the blue for men. And so you can see that the mean and the median coincide. The 50th centile is the exact point where the mean height sits. And then the distribution is symmetric around that point and tails off. So we know with a degree of supreme accuracy that 68% of the US male population will fall within one standard deviation of that mean point. Okay. And that 95% will sit within 2 standard deviations and 99% within 3 standard deviations, meaning that if you get someone who is over a certain height, there's a less than 1% chance of that happening. So they are a 1 in 100 sort of person. In fact, you can then sort of take this to IQ, and IQ is a common metric of intellectual strength, so the so-called intelligence quotient, and you get the same normal distribution. 100 is the mean and the median point. The first two white lines on either side of that median point describe a single standard deviation either above or below that mean. And in that, 68% of the population will sit. So the vast majority of people will be one standard deviation above or below 100 IQ, which means between a range of 85 to 115. Okay, then two standard deviations will include up to 95%. So that's a range from 70 to 130. And then anything above 130 is getting into the 3 standard deviations removed. 4 standard deviations removed, you're getting into sort of 1 in 1,000 territory. Now, as participants in Seren, you are likely 3 standard deviations above the mean when it comes to intelligence. So you are a fraction of 1% representative of the population. So you are a 1 in 100 sort of character, most likely. And that is a simple bit of sort of mathematics that most people don't appreciate. But mathematics itself can reinforce perceptive delusions. And one of the most toxic perceptive delusions when it comes to the IQ test is that IQ is immutable, that you cannot change your IQ, despite there being abundant evidence to the contrary that you can, that people can enhance their cognition. There may be certain ceilings beyond which they may struggle to advance as a result of something to do with their neural physiology. But those ceilings are probably way beyond what most people think they are, because we are constantly told that IQ is a fixed commodity. Now, this, to my mind, is desperately ironic, because on the one hand, our society constantly tells us to suppress our weaknesses, to deny that we have anything wrong with us, to pretend that having something wrong with you is bad, that you should be ashamed of. And then at the same time, that you can't do anything about your IQ. It's fixed for life. You've got it from when you're a child and you'll never change it until you die, which we know to be false. So the general point is that when it comes to talking about strengths and weaknesses, we are surrounded by what might be described loosely as postmodernism. It's not fact, it's narrative based. Modernism was a movement that was triggered by the Enlightenment, and it was the veneration of the scientific method, the search for objective truth. Postmodernism is the step beyond that, wherein people started to realize that access to objective truth was almost entirely impossible in many cases. And therefore, what mattered was not so much what was true, but what you could convince people of, what sort of narratives you could develop to make people feel a certain way. And when it comes to strengths and weaknesses, this seems to be everywhere. Lots of people think they know a lot about what they're strong at, what they're weak at, but much of what they think they know is a function of that perception. And therefore, we need to do a bit of deconstruction. We need to sort of say to ourselves, well, why do I think that this is my strength and why do I think that this is my weakness? Where did that come from? Where did that narrative, that story come from? And how can I maybe change that narrative so that I can augment my strength or diminish my weakness, or at least live with my weakness? Just accept that it's okay to have certain weaknesses. It's normal. Even the people who are at the top of their proverbial games have weaknesses. Take a specific example. Sir Isaac Newton, one of the most important, if not the most important physicist that has ever existed. When he was a young man, he submitted a paper for publication, and it was reviewed by no less a person than Robert Hooke. Now, Robert Hooke was an Oxford academic, and he saw this paper from a young Cambridge academic, and he rejected it for publication. And Newton was so devastated that he did not write or publish anything for the next 20 years, after which he produced his Principia Mathematica. So he went through this incredibly long fallow period, which, side note, in modern academic circles would be completely impossible. Your career would be over if you didn't write anything for 20 years. But clearly, Newton struggled with interpersonal relations. It may be, we don't have proof of this, but it may be that he had what we now describe as Asperger's syndrome disorder or autistic syndrome disorder, because he clearly had difficulty with interpersonal relations. He was so upset with what Hooke had said and done to him that it crippled his capacity to write work going forward. Hooke clearly didn't understand the impact of his decision either. He didn't realize why it would stop such a promising young scientist from continuing to produce work. So there was clearly perceptual problems from both sides. But in this day and age, we wouldn't see, for example, difficulties in interpersonal relationships as a weakness, or we would just say, well, if it is in some instances making you less capable than others, then that doesn't matter. People come in so many different varieties that it's okay to maybe struggle with interpersonal relations. It's okay if you don't feel comfortable talking in a crowd. It's okay if you're exceptionally quick with mathematical calculations, but you take a longer time to read something. You know, a huge proportion of our young mathematicians at Oxford have dyslexia, but I wouldn't be, you know, stupid enough to say that they are weak. So I just think we need to stop and sit with what we think our lists of strengths and weaknesses are, and we need to deconstruct them. We need to tear them apart and put them into a proverbial acid bath to make us realize that a lot of what we think we know about strengths and weaknesses, we don't know at all, and are based on stories and myths that we've been told. From a more personal perspective, I have for years thought that I could not do maths, that I was bad at maths. And this was despite lots of evidence to the contrary. So I performed well in maths exams at schools, but I had a teacher when I was 13 who literally bullied me, a maths teacher. He used to humiliate me. He'd make me stand up on my table. He would make me try and solve mathematical puzzles he knew I couldn't solve. He would then mock me for getting it wrong. He was, now I can see with the benefit of maturity and hindsight, a sociopath. He had no idea of the harm he was causing. He couldn't empathize. He couldn't understand the emotional reaction that was unfolding in front of him. And yet he continued to do it because it empowered him. So he damaged my relationship with a particular intellectual methodology for 2 decades. And it's only when I grew up and realized that this was not a real weakness. This was a perceptive weakness. This was a narrative that someone had told me. Someone had told me you're bad at maths. And I just agreed with him. I just allowed that narrative to dominate my thinking for 2 decades. I should have done that sort of deconstructive analysis much earlier. And that's why I'm trying to share this with you now. It might not work for you, but it might do. And I think most of us could at least be a little bit more honest with how we gauge what we think are strengths and how we sit with our own weaknesses. Okay, so just to round off, I'm going to talk about a classic interview question, not for Oxford or Cambridge, but a classic interview question that you often get for jobs. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. You don't need to see all that. And that classic interview question is, list your 3 greatest weaknesses. Okay, so this is so classic. It's slipped magnificently into cliche, to the extent that I've never actually been asked it, but it's always something that I tend to prepare before job interviews. Anyway, list your 3 greatest weaknesses. It's actually an excellent question because it forces you to do a bit of this deconstructive analysis. It forces you to sort of itemize certain things that are weaknesses. Now, ideally, the point of that question is not for you to sort of identify your problems that you need to fix, nor is it an opportunity for your potential employers to realize that you could be dangerously ill-prepared for your job. The idea ought to be that they can help understand how you could fit into a team and how they could best support you to develop solutions to what might be your perceived weaknesses. But because of the nature of narratives that we get in our society, people tend to react to that question by downplaying their weaknesses or flipping the question in a certain way. For example, the classic answer to name a weakness is, oh, I'm a perfectionist. In other words, you're sort of saying, my weakness is that I have no weaknesses. And you're sort of ironically twisting the question around. Now, I think I am a perfectionist. And I think, hand on heart, that is a weakness. I think that's a terrible weakness. Because, as I mentioned earlier, being bad at certain things relative to other people, not being in the fattest part of the bell-shaped curve and not being on the side towards those who are better, is inevitable for some things, and therefore it's morally neutral. And so trying to constantly be on one side of the bell-shaped curve rather than the other is self-defeating. It's self-harm. It's self-abuse. And my constant attempts to be the best at everything is causing me harm. And therefore, my second weakness that I would list in this mythical interview would be I'm half blind. Now, again, it took me until my 30s before I realized that that wasn't my fault. Now, this sounds sort of slightly odd to be saying it out loud, and I'm sure many of you would think, well, that's crazy. Why would you do that? But it's very difficult to grow up with a hidden disability and that disempower you in certain contexts, and not to think that this was a weakness that you should somehow transcend through just force of will. And so, again, this is a very personal reflection, so it may not pertain to you at all, but I suspect that there will be some others of you out there who are thinking, well, there's this thing that I have no control over, and yet I ought to probably punish myself for it somehow, for some reason. And I guess my message would be, don't wait until your 30s to realize that it's okay to have certain weaknesses. It's not something you can do. And it may be that a physical disability is a fairly obvious incapacity, but there will be other less obvious forms of incapacity that you will also struggle to control, but they're also not your fault, and they're also okay to have, because some form of weakness is inevitable. There's a very famous dictum from Buddhist philosophy, which is that it is our desires that cause us our pain. And the route to nirvana is to get rid of all earthly desires. Now, the Buddha himself went whole hog on this, including giving up on his young wife and son and going off into the wilderness and founding this religion. Now, I'm not saying that he shouldn't have done that, because he created this amazing global phenomenon. But at the same time, I wouldn't have had the ability to do that personally. Anyway, the point is that it's the constant desire to be something that you're not, which will harm you, because of course it will. You're trying to fit yourself as a sort of round peg into a square hole. And if you do that, you'll just hurt yourself. So that's the second weakness, is that I'm half blind. But yet, obviously, that's a fairly silly thing to say as a weakness. The third weakness is that I am pathologically self-effacing. Now, what I mean by that is that I'm constantly trying to evaluate my performance relative to other people. I'm constantly trying to think, well, how can I be more like that person? How can I be less like myself and more like that other person? And again, I don't have evidence for this, but I suspect that's a common behavioral form, that lots of people tend to work out their own weaknesses through fairly non-scientific comparisons with the peer group around them. Now, obviously, some sort of systematic and structured comparisons of your peer group can be very helpful. Your A-levels, for example, will give you some decent data on how your skill set fares up relative to your peers. And there's no particular harm in that, provided that you realize that you can enhance those skills. They're not immutable skills. You can make them better if you want. But I think that there is potentially a problem if you go through this sort of compound process of denigrating the weaknesses you have as somehow pathological, trying to fix them constantly as if they'll go away when they won't, and constantly making unflattering comparisons to other people when you're not those other people, and therefore you couldn't possibly evince the same skill set that they do. So when I say that my three weaknesses are being a perfectionist, being half blind, and being self-effacing, I'm saying so with a degree of sort of wry irony as a result of some deconstruction. But at the same time, I also think that in many cases, they are my ultimate weaknesses. And it's only as a result of maturity and support from others that I've been able to make some peace with those. And all I'm trying to encourage you to do is to spend a little time of your own being self-reflective and deconstructing your own lists of what you think are your strengths and what you think are your weaknesses. Don't be hard on yourself if you have certain weaknesses, because weaknesses are inevitable. Also, don't be too deluded about your strengths. There's a very interesting psychological theory called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which describes an inverse correlation between skills and confidence. And it's actually quite intuitive if you think about it. Basically, people who are incredibly highly skilled and knowledgeable tend to have quite low confidence in themselves. And that's because they know how much better they could be. They have studied a subject, for example, and they know the gaps in their capabilities. And Conversely, someone who is highly unskilled and lacking in knowledge tends to be in excessive confidence of themselves. And so we tend to see this when some people who have not thought about a particular problem in any detail tend to have very strong opinions about how it ought to be continued. We've perhaps seen this with debates on the wearing of masks or the taking of vaccines. The people who've not considered the problem at all tend to have the most forthright opinions. So we are all capable of that. So I am not trying to sneer at people who have had less of an opportunity to study these things than I have from my privileged position. But at the same time, we are all capable of those intellectual blind spots. So it's not just our strengths that we need to be, it's not just our weaknesses that we need to be conscious of and critically analyzing. It's also our strengths. And I think this can be extremely instrumentally useful. It may be that you're sort of wondering, well, why should I go through this sort of period of self-reflection? How is that going to make me a better academic? Well, if it makes you come to peace with certain things that are inevitable about your character, then you'll save a lot of potential harm to yourself. You'll also realize those skills that you have and how much more you can enhance and augment them. Don't forget that most of the skills we think we have that are immutable are not. Your height may be pretty much fixed, as the bell-shaped curve would suggest, but your IQ is not. There is tons of evidence to suggest you can augment and enhance your IQ. So don't allow yourself to be fooled into this notion that once you've got a skill set, it can't be improved. And that's intuitive if you think of anyone with extraordinary skills, a surgeon, a professional basketball player, a sushi chef. They spend years and years in training to make themselves enhanced cognitively. When they cut open Einstein's brain, they found not only did it have more glial cells than the average brain, because he'd made connections, he'd forged new interneuronal connections as a result of just working hard. He also had what's called an omega loop, which is formed from playing the violin so much that his hand-eye movements had created and changed his neural architecture. And you can do the same. So don't ever delude yourself into thinking that your skill set is fixed and immutable, because there is tons of evidence to suggest to the contrary. Anyway, I've said a lot. There's a lot to think about. The key lessons are there are two tools that I think most of us, although maybe not all of us, could benefit from. And that's a bit more deconstructive analysis, a bit more critical thinking, and some of the methods of cognitive therapy. All right. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying the content. Do keep in touch if you have any questions. And yeah, I look forward to working with you again later in the week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.